Gov Law 1.3, Federalism. And yes, that's cake. If you remember back from the last video, federalism is the power that is divided between the state and the national governments. The United States is, as the name implies, a union of states. Unlike many other nations, the national government does not have all the authority in our system. Rights and powers are reserved to states by the 10th Amendment. But the situation is even more complicated than just having state governments and the national government. There's almost 89,000 separate governmental units in this nation, everything from a school district to a township to a county, which leads to a lot of complexity and a lot of overlap. So there's an analogy that's been put forth to understand how federalism works. One of the analogies is that America is a layer cake federalism, and layer cake federalism is based on a clear delineation of authority and programs among the levels of government. So you could have state government at one level, maybe somewhere in the middle, and then national government on top, and then maybe at the lowest level you have cities and townships, and somewhere in between you've got school districts or counties, etc. However, most people usually use the marble cake analogy to understand American federalism. The marble cake federalism analogy is that it's based on a pragmatic mixing of authority and programs among the national, state, and local governments. So everything's kind of mixed and mushed together, which leads to a complex understanding of how our system works. Because we have criminal laws, state law, national law, etc., where you can be tried in different courts for different things. So this video is going to try to get you to understand the differences between some of those federalism components in understanding our complex American government system. The best way to understand our system is to look at different types of governments. There's more than 200 independent countries in the entire world. Each has their own system of government. Generally, though, we can describe how each country structures its relations between central governments and more local units like states in terms of three different models or types: the unitary system, the confederal system, and of course our own system, the federal system. The most popular, both historically and today, is what we call the unitary system. The unitary system of government is probably the easiest to define. Unitary systems allow ultimate government authority to rest in the hands of the national or central government. Consider a typical unitary system like France. There are regions, departments, and communes in France. The regions, departments, and communes have elected and appointed officials. But at the surface, the French system looks very similar to the U.S. system, but the similarity is only on the surface. Under the unitary French system, the decisions of the lower levels of government can be overruled by the national government. That's like the federal government here being allowed to tell states that they can or can't do something based on what the federal government thinks is wrong or right, not based on the Constitution. So if you think about this as an analogy of a teeter-totter, then the teeter-totter itself representing power. In countries like France, Britain, and Japan, the central government has all the power, so it would be the elephant, whereas the local governments have little to no power unless that power was authorized by the central government itself. And in this case, the central government is the elephant. We're going to look at the exact opposite of a unitary system, and that's a confederal system. A confederation is a league of independent states in which a central government or administration handles only matters of common concern expressly delegated to it by member states. The central government has no ability to make laws directly applicable to member states unless the member states explicitly support such laws. The United States, under the Articles of Confederation, was a confederal system. Things like that today would be like the European Union, known as the EU, NATO, and the UN. Each of those doesn't have power unless given to it by the local or more smaller centralized areas. So in this case, the teeter-totter, again, would be representing power. But the roles are exactly opposite. The elephant here would be the local power, such as a state, and the thing that has very little power is the central government. So the roles in a confederal system are the exact opposite as they are in a unitary system. A federal system, a system like that in the United States, lies between the unitary and confederal forms of government. Power is divided by a written document, such as a constitution. There are national, state, and local governments, each having their own supreme authority in their own spheres. So if we look at the teeter-totter analogy in the United States, the teeter-totter itself represents power. The states have somewhat equal or even greater power than the central or national government. So this leads a more balanced playing field between the two groups in order to balance authority in each of their spheres, whether that sphere is the entire country, each local state, or each local independent authority. Many Americans and foreigners alike wonder why our system is so complex and complicated, but really it was a practical constitutional solution considering the size of the United States at the time our country was formed. Our country was formed with the 13 original colonies, which became the first 13 states, and the reason federalism was put in place was as a remedy to the sheer size of the United States. It gave each local authority, whether that's Georgia or Pennsylvania or New Hampshire, more local control, but still bound all the states together. Also, it allows for programs to be piloted by smaller political units like the states first. For example, Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, was the first state to provide some kind of unemployment benefits when people are unemployed for whatever reason, as we learned about in economics. This system was piloted first in Wisconsin and eventually adopted nationwide. Many of our national programs were actually first piloted in the states. So there's a lot of historical basis and logical reasoning for our complex system being created in the Constitution. There are lots and lots of benefits to the federal system. It allows for many political subcultures to exist, whether they be right-wing, left-wing, or somewhere in between. But there also are some pretty significant drawbacks. The drawbacks of American federalism: it is a complex system like marble cake. When things get mixed together, it can sometimes get confusing which authority belongs to whom. It can lead to the fact that each state or each county or city can block national progress on a certain program. And it can also cause inequality between the states. For example, education spending is a state right, so each state spends something different on education. So whereas Minnesota spends one of the highest amounts in the entire nation on education spending, Mississippi spends one of the lowest amounts per student on education spending, which can lead to inequality in our systems. The term federal system cannot be found in the U.S. Constitution, nor is it possible to find a systematic division of governmental authority between the nation and the state governments in that actual document. Rather, the Constitution sets out very different types of power. These powers can be classified as national power, state power, prohibited power, and concurrent power. So these four types of power are those outlined in the Constitution, and all of these types of power are actually federalism without using the term. So that's why federalism is a theme of the Constitution. Just like themes in literature, they're not inherently written, however, they're very expressly obvious when looking at the actual text. Looking at national power, a lot of our national power, or the power of the national government, is given in Article 1, most of those powers in Congress, but also laid out in Article 2 and 3, and some of the other articles as well. National power exists in a few very different examples. One of those things is expressed power. So expressed power are things that are written. Congress has the power to coin money, set standards for weights and measures, the power to admit new states, the power to declare war, etc. Also, within national power, there are what we call implied powers of federalism. That's the elastic clause. That's Article 1, Section 8, which Congress shall have the power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper, which allows the Congress to create all sorts of different federal agencies, from the FCC to the Federal Reserve to the EPA, etc. Furthermore, in the U.S. Constitution, there's this implication of the fact that the national government also has inherent powers. The inherent powers are a little bit confusing. These powers derive from the fact that the United States is a sovereign or independent power among other nations, and so its national government must be the only government that deals with other nations. Under international law, it's assumed that nation-states, like the United States, regardless of their size or their power, have an inherent right to ensure their own survival. To do this, each nation must have the ability to act in its own self-interest among and within the community of nations by, for instance, making treaties, waging wars, seeking trade, and acquiring territory. So if we think of an example, in 2006, many Americans were outraged to learn that the federal government was considering allowing a Middle East-based company to take over the contracts to operate several American ports, like those in Los Angeles and Baltimore. Such an action would have been an exercise of the national government's inherent powers, which can sometimes be confusing. For example, Obama and several other presidents have used their inherent powers to try to protect the nation and its own survival by using agencies such as the IRS to investigate, whether legally or illegal, actions of certain citizens. Inherent powers are controversial because not only are they not necessarily implied in the Constitution, they're part of international law, which most people would agree each nation has to interpret international laws as they deem fit. Federalism also covers a thing called state powers. State powers are laid out in the 10th Amendment, but the 10th Amendment is a little bit ambiguous and has allowed for the reserved powers, those powers that are reserved for the states, to be defined differently at different times in our history. But we do know that each state has the right to regulate commerce within its state, and it also has all power denied to the national government. This implies that each state has what's called police power. Police power is the authority to legislate for the protection for the health, morals, safety, and welfare of the people. That's why each state sets its own criminal law, each state has its own marriage law, each state has its own education laws and land use. Which leads to, again, like I said before, some inequality within the states. If we take a look at this visual shows the average freshman graduation rate for public high school students in 2009-2010. We can see that Minnesota has one of the highest averages in the country at 88.2%. The national average is 78%, and we can see that there are some significantly lower areas, such as those in Nevada at 57.8%, and other states who have a much smaller graduation rate percentage. So this inequality can sometimes be challenging for American citizens because of this policy of federalism or division of power. To confuse us even further, federalism also includes what we call concurrent powers, or those powers that are held jointly by national and state governments. They're not expressed in the Constitution, but they're only implied. An example of this is taxation. The types of taxes are divided between the levels of government. For example, states charge you a property tax, or your local authority does, in addition to sales tax, whereas the national government will charge you an income tax. Also, states and federal governments share concurrent power in establishing courts and chartering banks. There's been a question in recent years about the police power. Is it a concurrent or shared power? If we take a look at this map shows us legislation in reference to the use of marijuana in each state across the nation. In looking at this map, the ones that have become increasingly problematic in the last year are the ones in dark blue. So Washington and Colorado, marijuana has become legal for adult use, and state law regulates and taxes marijuana sales. They also have medical marijuana laws in those states, but the issue has become the federal government has outlawed marijuana to be used for non-medicinal purposes, and so the question has become, who has police power? Is it something that is shared between the national and the state governments, or does it solely belong to the states, which will inevitably lead to some kind of federal or national decision in reference to marijuana legalization, whether it's for medicinal or recreational purposes? And finally, federalism includes what we call prohibited powers. Prohibited powers are those powers that are expressly prohibited by the U.S. Constitution. For example, each state cannot enter into a treaty with another country on its own. It takes the entire national government to do so. Also, the national government cannot tax exports either. So there are prohibited powers. So these 4 types of powers that are included within federalism, yes, they sometimes complicate the system. However, they're meant to clarify who has what power in what area of the country. And finally, since federalism is a very complex topic, political cartoonists are constantly poking fun at the differentiation between federal and state laws about any number of things, specifically California. California has very tough environmental standards on their cars, that are much tougher than the national laws, which sometimes leads to problems and challenges when creating some kind of national standard.